What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. So Gerry Duggan is perhaps one of the best comic book writers that's out there right now, because it takes a kind of skill to be able to write a story that is one part humor and one part seriousness, but blend them together in a way where you never know how it's going to switch from one theme to the other, or sometimes they're both combined. But for some reason or another, Gerry Duggan's able to do it. So it's it is kind of intriguing. Now, there are a couple things that go into this, because honestly, we have not covered all new, all different Guardians of the Galaxy, and maybe we can, but this sets the stage for the hunt for the Infinity Stones. It's really what this is. For those of you guys who have been keeping track of Marvel Legacy and the things that have been going on, the general idea is that it's going to see this sort of segue into the return of the Infinity Stones. Now, a lot of that was announced when Marvel Legacy first launched, and a lot of that's designed to segue into the launch of Infinity War in May. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense to go that route, but it is interesting because what this initially does is this picks up with the Brotherhood of the Raptors. Now, the Brotherhood of the Raptors is actually a group that appeared back in War of Kings, and they're basically a splinter group from the traditional Shi'ar Empire is really all they are. Of course, the Shi'ar Empire is the spacefaring race. It's really more of an amalgamation of races that all swear fealty to like the existing emperor or, empress, but there are splinter like militaristic groups, those individuals who have just broken off from the main Shi'ar Empire itself and gone off to do their own thing. And what this does is it actually picks up with a guy by the name of Talon-Ar. Now, Talon-Ar is the brother of Richard Rider. His actual name is Robert Rider, but he's one of these characters that, and we've talked about this before when we've gone through like, character explanations and so on. He's one of these characters who was originally introduced way back in like 1976 and then reworked. And that really happens with like a lot of different characters who are out there. And it's cool because in the the free comic book day, I think it was, for all new Guardians of the Galaxy, the story of Talon-Ar was basically reworked to essentially say that at some point along the line, Robert Rider was a member of the Nova Corps, but ultimately he fell in with the Raptors, was really kind of shanghaied in, and then subjected to brainwashing that kind of warped his mind and then drove him to swear absolute loyalty to the Raptors themselves and eventually kind of take over the group. And so that's really one of the reasons why, or really the biggest reason why, he's a main villain here. Now, there is some backup that goes on with regards to this tidbit in the sense that there is something called the Negabands. Now, the Negabands themselves, those go back quite some time. I mean, those go back all the way to like 1969 with Captain Marvel number 16, I think. But the biggest reason why Talon-Ar has them here, and the biggest reason why they're so sought after for the most part, is because they allow a kind of cosmic awareness. Now, in truth, cosmic awareness is a roll of the dice. There's no guarantee that because you wield the Negabands that you'll have cosmic awareness. But the whole idea is that if Talon-Ar has the Negabands, which he does, and if he can get them to work and he achieves cosmic awareness, he'll be able to locate the Infinity Stones. And so that's the whole basis behind this, is being able to understand, everything that's going on and where it all comes to. Now, the whole idea behind how he attained them is that originally Star-Lord had one and then Robert Rider had one. And in order to basically strike a bargain of sorts, what ended up happening is, Star-Lord basically handed his over, but actually threw it through a portal, and it ended up sending Talon-Ar into this other planet where basically everybody had been converted into Ultrons, much the same way that we saw in Annihilation Conquest, and we'll revisit that in this particular video. But it is kind of a cool idea, because essentially the long and short of this is that Talon-Ar now has the Negabands to himself, and he's trying to get them to work in unison. And so at this point, we pick up with the Nova Corps itself. Now remember, a lot of this is kind of like a reworking of the whole Nova Corps concept. It's kind of a repeating cycle in a lot of ways, in the sense that the Nova Corps was Marvel's answer to DC's Green Lantern Corps. But the idea was that the Nova Corps was effectively wiped out during the events of Annihilation. I can never remember if it was Annihilation or Annihilation Conquest. But while the Nova Corps kind of experienced these waxes and wanes, they were effectively pushed to the brink of extinction and annihilated. Now, eventually they were recreated by the World Mind, and which is basically the source of energy that Richard Rider got his power from, that all the Nova Corps members get their power from. It was recreated by the World Mind. The World Mind was operating basically outside of Richard Rider. When Richard realized what was going on, he was effectively banished, and then he retook the Nova Prime mantle, and then ousted the World Mind, and then basically shut down the Nova Corps. There were a lot of things that went on with regards to that whole history, and you'll find that in my video on Richard Rider Explained. That'll cover everything that you guys want to know. Really, going up to this point now, there really wasn't a Nova Corps. You kind of had one to a degree, but there wasn't really a Nova Corps in terms of how it exists now. It was largely just Richard Rider and Sam Alexander, and then the hunt for Sam Alexander's dad, and that was really all there was to it. So at this point, it's a rebuilding phase. But because of the fact that the Nova Corps at its peak was one of the most powerful forces in the universe, there were a lot of eyes watching this, a lot of people who were curious about what's going on. Now, what this does is it brings in the Guardians, who have basically joined the Nova Corps, and it's kind of interesting. But one character I also want you guys to take note of here is Ant-Man. Now, a lot of this comes out of Secret Empire, in the sense that with the whole Secret Empire event taking place, Ant-Man basically betraying the Resistance for the most part, handing information over to the forces of Hydra. Once the whole conflict ended and his loyalty to the superhero community was called called into question, it was really more of like a crisis of conscience. And, you know, Ant-Man Scott Lang just kind of said, look, I just want to leave, disappear. And so what he did is literally book passage with the Guardians of the Galaxy when they left Earth for the intention of walking away. And that's why as you read this story, you know, when you get out and you buy it and you read through it, what you'll find is there'll be references to nowhere, like the last stop for people who want to disappear. They basically go to nowhere, this sort of cosmic hangout, this cosmic bar on the edge of the universe, and then they just kind of vanish from there. They just book passage towards some ship, and usually people never hear from them again because they don't want to be heard from again. And so again, it is pretty intriguing. The funny thing about this is that the Guardians are on the hunt for the Infinity Stones, but it's also a little bit of humor that gets thrown in here, you know, some funny moments that take place. What we end up having, for instance, is this point where Rocket Raccoon talks to one of the guys named Turgslav, I think it is, and Turgslav worked as a security advisor on his planet that housed like a lot of fine art and different things like that. And Rocket Raccoon is casing the joint. He's like, hey man, your planet housed fine art and things like that, right? Like very expensive artwork. And you know, the guy's like, yeah man, it did. You know, I was a security consultant. And Rocket's like, good, like tell me everything you know, just so that we can make sure that their planet is defended adequately. It's small little things like that that really kind of bring in these funny moments. And again, it kind of continues on. Rocket Raccoon has really been brought in here alongside the other Guardians to really kind of test and vet the members of the Nova Corps, because with the team basically being reformed, there's a lot of people who are looking to bring it down. There's a lot of people who are looking to either destroy it in its entirety or to infiltrate it for a variety of reasons, just to kind of spy on them and see how things are going. But, you know, along the way, when you end up having like, you know, Gamora and you end up having Scott Lang, who are basically checking out this distress signal more or less, where a massive number of people are presumed to have died, what we end up having is them showing up alongside, you know, several other members of the Nova Corps and discovering the entire place has been overrun with Ultron robots. Now, this is really designed to be a homage to like Annihilation Conquest, as well as picking up on the idea that like the Ultron virus has spread. Now, the cool thing about this is, remember, Annihilation Conquest was basically a story where the essence of Ultron had been just kind of jettisoned into space by the Avengers, and then eventually took over a group called the Phalanx. It's kind of weird to describe them, but they're like walking, talking machines. Ultron had taken over them and then like began conquering portions of the universe. So it was actually pretty cool in terms of how that happened. But of course, that's exactly what's happening here. You know, the Ultron virus is effectively spreading. But if you're going through this and you start to see that there's like a measure of familiarity between the, you know, Guardians of the Galaxy or like the Nova Corps in terms of like what's happening with the spread of these Ultrons, that's because of Annihilation Conquest, because it's happened before. Of course, it's interesting because with this whole, you know, community being overrun by Ultrons, they're there to rescue a handful of people. The problem is that once they get out there, the ship they brought is basically gone. And it's funny because a couple of these folks are like, dude, we were better, like we were safer when we were hiding. You're here to rescue us and now we're all gonna die. Which is kind of cool. But what we end up finding out is that while this ship was sitting in dock with the crew waiting for, you know, the other members of the Nova Corps, for Gamora and Scott Lang to come back, that the ship had more or less, or at least it looked like the ship was going to be overrun by these Ultrons. So it was really one of those, let's get out of here and then let's come back once they're gone, grab the rest of our team, the survivors, and let's get out of here. It is pretty interesting in terms of how it unfolds and how it works. Again, you know, with like Rocket Raccoon, for example, going through, you've got members of the Nova Corps who are like looting derelict ships, you know, ships that have been caught by the Nova Corps, you know, because they were just kind of adrift in space for whatever reason, you know, and you have members of the Corps who are looting it, taking clothes, taking alcohol, different things like that. Again, it's very much designed to hit at the idea that there's some pretty seedy elements to the Nova Corps that in desperate times you get what you can. Now, the other half of this is that this also deals with Star-Lord basically learning that Richard Rider is alive. Now, Richard Rider was basically the jumping off platform for everything that is the Nova Corps. It all started with Richard Rider. Younger people who've been picking up comics within the last 10 years probably think of Sam Alexander, but Richard Rider was the one who kicked it all off. And he was always kind of the front runner for the Nova Corps. And in the early comics, you learned as he learned. You know, when he first became Nova and was taken to Xandar and learned about the world mind and about the Nova Corps itself, it was very much in tune with the old Green Lantern stories, but you followed Richard Rider along his journey. Now, over the years in Marvel Comics, as stories have been expanded and things have waxed and waned, there was a pretty strong friendship that formed between Star-Lord and Richard Rider. And this really came to a head in the Thanos imperative when you had the Cancerverse, basically a rift that formed between the main Marvel universe and this other universe where nobody could die because death was destroyed. And so when that led into the whole Thanos imperative story and those villains came pouring out and so on and so forth, ultimately it took Thanos, Richard Rider, and Star-Lord entering into the Cancerverse to bring it all to an end. The idea behind this was that Star-Lord eventually escaped, Richard Rider and Thanos were left behind, Thanos eventually escaped, and then Richard Rider was stuck there. Now, when Richard Rider eventually returned, Sam Alexander was the first one to learn about it. And so, of course, Sam Alexander and Richard Rider teamed up, and there were some cool stories storytelling that went on there, but Richard Rider never got back into contact with Star-Lord. And so as it stands right now, at the time this story is being written, Peter Quill is just now learning that Richard Rider is alive. And it's kind of a betrayal of friendship because they fought together during Annihilation. They fought side by side against overwhelming odds. With all those things that have happened, the sacrifice of the Cancerverse, all that's taking place, the biggest thought that Peter Quill would have had is, look, when Richard Rider comes back, he would have sought me out. What Peter Quill doesn't know is a lot of things were going on there. The world mine that Richard Rider had used was one of the means by which he made his escape along with the Cosmic Cube. The world mine felt betrayed. The world mine took over the Cancerverse. When Richard Rider effectively came back, he had to contend with all that stuff. There were a lot of things that were going on, and really getting back into contact with Star-Lord was the least of his concerns. But it is kind of cool because it's one of those things where it's like, okay, look, we're back together now, we're friends now, we'll deal with this later. At the moment, we've got bigger fish to fry. And so what they're doing is they're basically seeking after a handful of members of the Nova Corps who had basically defected, who had walked away, and no one really knew why. They were just trying to figure out what had gone on. Now, the belief initially was that they had lost faith in the Corps, or they had gone off to perform their own goal, or whatever the case may have been. But once they get in there, they're basically attacked by a pregnant member of the Nova Corps, which is really kind of cool. But once they figure out that she's pregnant, what she does when everything kind of stands down, and she, it's, hey, look, I'm Richard Rider, and hey, look, everything's cool, like everybody chill, we're all good. What we end up finding out here is that this place is essentially home to the Power Stone, to the Infinity Stone. Now, I want to talk about this for a second because I've seen different posts where people talk about the Power Stone and what the Power Stone does. One of the misconceptions people have is the Power Stone serves the purpose of just amplifying power. The idea of the Power Stone is it doesn't necessarily grant people any power that they want to. I mean, it can if a person knows how to use it correctly, but if you just walk up to it and touch it, then all it does is amplify whatever you have. So in the case of a human, it'll give you super strength. If you're a telepath, it'll elevate your telepathy. It simply just exists to kind of elevate what abilities you have. Now, in terms of its relation to the other Infinity Stones, what it basically does is it serves as a kind of bedrock. The Power Stone is a source of infinite power. And so it essentially operates as the foundation by essentially providing a power source for all the other stones so that they can all work in unison. Now, again, it has waxed and waned. I mean, when the Power Stone was first put in the hands of like the champion of the universe, for example, all it did is simply just make him stronger and allow him to fight for a longer amount of time. But Thanos had come along and said, well, you're doing that because you don't know how to use it effectively. In reality, the Power Stone will actually give you any power you want. You just don't know how to use it that way. Now, of course, again, this is kind of cool because it hits on that with Star-Lord, where he basically crushes a gun with his bare hands because it, amplifies his own strength. The problem with this is that an Infinity Stone having been located is no small thing. An Infinity Stone floating out there, having been located, will basically lead to like a great gold rush of virtually every race in existence trying to find it. Because remember, the stones want to be found. That was confirmed during the whole Illuminati storyline. All you have to find is just one Infinity Stone, and then it will lead you to the others because they all want to be brought together in unison. And so again, that's why it's a big deal, because it'll serve as a tracking device for all the other stones. Now, the other half of this is that with Rocket Raccoon going through and locating these various individuals and so on and so forth, again, it's just kind of the Nova Corps performing these small acts to kind of regain trust in humanity. For example, there's another SOS that's sent out. Drax the Destroyer alongside a handful of other Nova Corps members show up, and they find basically a woman and a few kids who are just kind of hanging out there, and they've been captured by members of the Nova Corps, some of whom want to basically eliminate them. Of course, Drax stops that from happening and says, look, it's not okay to take an innocent life. These people don't pose any real threat. It's a live and let live kind of thing. Well, then this is a throwback to like 1960s, 1970s comics, because you have this chick who just kind of blasts, Drax the Destroyer with telepathy and says, hey, look, we're good guys, but these members of the Nova Corps, they're actually spies for the fraternity of Raptors. They're spies for the Shi'ar, and they're trying to find a way to infiltrate the Nova Corps and bring it down, which is cool because Drax the Destroyer immediately turns on these guys. Now, at this point, Drax the Destroyer has kind of walked away from the life of killing, which has been a repeating cycle for his character. I mean, there's been points where he's like, look, I'm only a peacekeeping guy. I don't really want to destroy things. I don't want to kill things. And then that kind of grows stale after a while. And so Marvel switches him back over and says, okay, so like Drax the Destroyer is going to start killing stuff again. It is kind of cool in terms of how that plays out, that evolution of his character. But ultimately, he's basically the one that saves his family. He eliminates these spies. And then, this family kind of goes along their way. And then that's really the end of that. But again, it's designed to hit at the idea that the Nova Corps is not as strong as we originally, as it used to be, in the sense that it's filled with criminals, filled with spies, people who are looking to gain the upper hand on all the information that's there. Drax the Destroyer is having a hard time dealing with the situation. So he basically goes and puts on Jungle Land by Bruce Springsteen, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of funny. It's like, it's the only thing that could calm me down. He starts to play the saxophone. It's actually pretty amazing. It's very much capturing the essence of the Guardians of the Galaxy films and throwing it into comic book form, which is a beautiful thing to see. It's actually pretty amazing. But following this, of course, again, there is another SOS, and this SOS really kind of comes out of nowhere. Again, this cosmic bar that just kind of floats out there, and you end up having like what looks like Groot tearing things up. Now, of course, this version of Groot is basically destroyed, and it's destroyed by Cosmo. Now, Cosmo, I don't think we've ever really talked about him before, but Cosmo is basically a Russian telepathic dog who is the head of security in Nowhere. I know it sounds bonkers, but like, believe me when I tell you, Cosmo has a fan base, and they are dedicated. They love Cosmo. I'm one of them. I love the idea of Cosmo. It's hilarious because he just speaks telepathically. The funniest thing about him, though, is how people react to him. The idea of like, hey, so like this is a telepathic dog that has a Russian accent? It's kind of weird. Like, it was always kind of a funny answer to that question. If a person has an accent and they have telepathy, does their telepathy come in the form of an accent? Like, does a person who speaks Japanese think in Japanese? I don't know. I always thought that was kind of an interesting question, but it is kind of cool because at this point we basically pick up with the idea that like all these floral colossi are just tearing things to pieces. They're ripping things up. But this is cool because this is actually a throwback to the very first appearance of Groot. Originally, when Groot first showed up, it was in a series of stories that involved the Incredible Hulk. Really, it was the Incredible Hulk going against a villain, but this villain had brought in like all these different enemies. But fighting against Groot, it was basically just like this floral colossi, and that was it. It was just a giant tree, and the Incredible Hulk smashed it to pieces, turned it into a tree stump, and that was really about it. It was a pretty short fight. It was like 3 pages long, but it was kind of interesting because what ended up happening is Marvel used this to kind of rework the character of Groot and then bring him back in as the character that we all know now. But it is cool because we get a throwback to that, basically saying, hey, look, the reason why that original version of Groot existed is because it was the creature from Planet X. That's how he was originally built. And so because of that, it was a way for Marvel to come along and say Groot is just one of a multitude of different creatures that all are basically walking, talking trees, or Ents, if you want to call them that. But it is kind of cool because it basically hit at this idea that there are more versions of them. Now, by and large, it was always believed Groot was the last of his kind, that there were no other versions of him. And so what this means is that someone's creating more Groots. This leads to the Guardians basically facing off against this evil version of Groot, having to, burn them to pieces and so on and so forth. But it is an army of these things. And it's kind of funny because Drax is like, look, I can't do it. I can't bring myself to kill and burn another being. And Groot's like, I can, and like burns this dude to pieces. Which is pretty brutal when you think about it. But again, because of the fact that they're villains and because of the fact that they're bad guys, they're dealt with pretty swiftly. But again, it's designed to kind of hit at all this stuff. All these things are happening all at the same time. And when it comes to all these evil versions of Groots, the question is, who's creating them? Where are they coming from? How are they getting here? And so the initial indication that's put off is that, well, they're being created by the Gardener. The Gardener is just one of these elders of the universe. Now, this again goes to hit back at the idea that it really kind of repeats the old stories of like Thanos' quest, when Thanos is tracking down all the Infinity Stones and the Gardener was in possession of the Time Stone that the Gardener had, that the Gardener was warping time around him and using that to like speed up the growth of the things that he was making. He didn't really realize that's what he was doing, but that's what he was doing. And then Thanos kind of like screwed up the Gardener in a pretty messed up way. It was actually pretty rough. He looked pretty brutal by the time Thanos got done with him. But the fact remains here that what ends up happening is the whole idea of Groot was to go through and find all the crooked members of the Nova Corps and then in turn throw them all in cells and basically just arrest them and say you're all going to be discharged and you all have disgraced the Nova Corps mantle. Now this is funny, and this is actually really cool because what this does, it shows how smart Rocket Raccoon is. Rocket's one of those characters where it's very easy to kind of sweep him under the rug and say he's just the guy who loves guns, but he's actually really, really smart here. What he does is he tells the local leader of the Nova Corps, the reason why I did this is because there's two types of people in this world. There are people who are squeaky clean, and there are people who have committed crimes and done shady things. But the ones who are squeaky clean are usually the bad guys. And that's what it is that he says here. He says, look, what you have is you have these members of the Nova Corps who basically are just whatever their planets would send out to join the Nova Corps because nobody really trusts the Nova Corps yet. So they're not going to send their best soldiers. They're going to send the second best or the third best. So you get the ones who are a little shady, who are a little rough around the edges. But that's because nobody wants to send you the good guys. What that means is if there are people here who are squeaky clean and who have never committed any bad acts, it's because they're lying. They're spies for the fraternity of Raptors, because if they're going to get caught for something, it's not going to be for, stealing or looting or anything like that. And so it's basically Rocket saying the guys who never did anything bad, the guys that don't have anything on, those are your spies. These guys, they're your average soldiers. They're the only members of the Nova Corps you can trust. And it's funny because this guy's response is, so the only members of the Nova Corps that I can trust are the ones who are on the take, and it's And it's kind of funny, but it's so smart and it's absolutely genius because it was a way for Rocket to separate those who were legitimate members of the team from those who were spies. And so at that point, it's basically grabbing arms and armament, putting them all in a giant container, taking it back to the guys who were locked up and saying, look, you're the only ones that we can trust. And so at this point, we got to take out the fraternity of the Raptors. Now it's cool because these fraternity of Raptor spies don't know what Rocket's doing. And so when they report back to Talon-R, their argument is, hey, these guys are bumbling buffoons, man. Like, you guys won't believe it. They arrested everybody who wasn't us. They believe we're the good guys. They're going to be helpless to stop us. And it's cool. And so with Talon-R making his move, attacking the Guardians of the Galaxy, this basically leads to, the Guardians and the Nova Corps going to war against Talon-R himself, which ends pretty swiftly as you would expect. Now, at this point, we transition away from the Guardians of the Galaxy and we pick up with the return of one of my favorite characters, Adam Warlock. Now, Adam Warlock's return here is ambiguous at best. We know nothing about this. All we know is that Adam Warlock is basically in Soul World, and that's it. Now, there's a reason why Jerry Duggan's doing this. Adam Warlock and the Soul Gem go hand in hand, and it's always been that way. That was the first Soul Stone Adam Warlock had, and I want to say the Soul Stone was the first Soul Stone, or the first Infinity Stone to ever appear in Marvel Comics. But the whole idea behind this is that because Adam Warlock was in possession of the Soul Stone for so long, that a piece of his soul itself had kind of leached out into Soul World, meaning he is part and parcel to the Soul Stone. That's why when things like, the Infinity Watch were formed, where basically the Infinity Stones are being guarded by various people, Thanos, Gamora, Moondragon, Pip the Troll, so on and so forth, Adam Warlock held onto the Soul Stone because it's part and parcel to who he is. It's a part of him now. The other half of this is him going through, and he's just kind of seeing how things are progressing. If it's the past, the present, the future, he's not given any definitive answers here. And the Soul Stone is just kind of a reflection of who you are. It's just a reflection of you as a being in terms of how you perceive it. It is also its own individual world, but the fact remains here that Adam Warlock is there. Adam Warlock is inside the Soul Stone. So it is kind of intriguing here. Now, the other half of this is that with this final battle between the Guardians of the Galaxy and, the Talon-R, the forces of Talon-R and the fraternity of Raptors, it goes exactly as you would expect. They do have a bit of genius here in the sense that none of the Nova Corps weapons will penetrate the shields of Talon-R's ship. So basically what they do is they just kind of send a beam of light. Ant-Man shrinks down to the size of a photon, boards the ship, and then just grows to a giant size and destroys the entirety of the ship. But it is kind of interesting. Of course, Talon-R retreats, and that's really the end of that. I mean, things end quick, fast, and in a hurry when it comes to that final battle. Of course, Richard Rider appears saying, hey, look, I'm ready to help, but of course, everything's already done and it's already concluded. But the funny thing about this is because Drax the Destroyer has taken more of like a peaceful approach, more of like a monk approach, what Peter Quill does is grab Drax and take him to where the Power Stone is, and he's effectively going to be the Guardian here. Now, the idea is that no one knows about the Power Stone. Drax is really supposed to be this Guardian, the guy that keeps it protected. But it's funny because we end up finding out that when Peter Quill was having a conversation about the Power Stone, when he had mentioned it, it had been overheard because one of the shape-shifting Skrulls was stowed aboard the Nova Corps. They were spying and they heard it. So they report to the Skrulls. You in turn have someone who basically gets a piece of information from one of the other members of the Nova Corps who reports it directly to them. Basically, this woman named Talinda. You end up having the Ultron robots who know about the Power Stone. You have like the Chitauri who take Talinda and they're like, we'll bargain your life. The reward you will receive for giving us the location of the Power Stone is like being able to continue living. So it's basically this idea that now everyone knows where the Power Stone is and everyone is vying for its location and everybody's going to try to track it down. So imagine the original Thanos quest storyline, but imagine that storyline's been modified so that everyone is trying to find the Infinity Stones. It actually sets the stage for some pretty amazing storytelling. Now, switching back to Adam Warlock, this gives us a piece of storytelling that we didn't have before. What we actually end up learning is that a portion of Gamora's soul is trapped inside the Soul Stone. We didn't know that. There was no reason to believe that. What this does is it establishes the idea that the Soul Stone takes no prisoners, that everyone is brought into the Soul Stone in some form or fashion. If you're in there long enough, it will take a piece of your soul. And so Gamora has been aging inside here, and that portion of Gamora wants to leave. Now, what this could do is it could serve as a purpose to basically return Gamora to the quote-unquote way she used to be, where she was violent, where she was just an assassin. It would be a way to basically say, okay, now Gamora can go off and do her own thing. She can go back to the way she was back in like the 80s. Now that part of her soul is back and she's her whole self. But Adam Warlock basically says, look, I'm not in possession of the Soul Stone, so I'm not bound to this place. I'm not required to be here. And so what he does is he effectively leaves and he wakes up. And when he does wake up, we end up finding out that he's in the presence of Kang the Conqueror. Why he's in the presence of Kang the Conqueror, we don't know. We simply just know that he's there. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comments Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. And yeah, from here, it continues on into the Infinity Countdown Adam Warlock one-shot, into the Infinity Countdown Prime, basically everything that leads into the whole main Infinity Countdown storyline that leads into Infinity War, presumably. Anyway, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.